What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Really appreciate your time and thanks for being here with me today. I am going to go through something with you today that I get asked about pretty frequently, and that is how do I sell my house or my condo if there's a tenant living in it? Because it can be relatively inconvenient for both parties, for you as the seller and for the tenant, because it's their house and it's being sold. So what happens? And so in today's video, I'm going to go through a few things with you. So the first portion of the video is going to be walking you through the protocol of what happens step by step if you sell the property to an end user. So if the purchaser wants to take occupancy or utilize the property for their own personal use. And then the second thing would be what happens if you sell the property to an investor. What are the protocols and how do we have that kind of communication with the tenant? And then after that, I'm going to go through 3 simple strategies that you can implement to make sure that this goes as smoothly as possible. Because like I said earlier, it's relatively inconvenient for both parties, but we've done it several times. And these are 3 strategies that we've used to make sure that we can get the highest price in the shortest amount of time in the most convenient way possible for the tenant so that we're not interrupting their lives for too long. So look forward to seeing you guys in the video. I would very much appreciate a like and a subscribe. If any of you want to get into contact with me in regards to this, if you're thinking about selling a property, you've got any questions about that, there's a link to my description, a link to my calendar in the description below, and I'd be happy to chat with you about that. So let's hop into it. If you want to sell a property to an end user, okay, so that would be somebody who's purchasing the property from you that wants to actually move in. There's a couple of steps that you need to take to make sure that you're in alignment with the landlord and tenant board rules before asking the tenant to vacate. So you need to have the property under contract before you provide any type of notice to the tenant. You can't kick the tenant out because you want to sell the property. You have to provide the tenant relevant notice to move out because you've sold the property, okay? And so what that typically will look like is one of 2 forms. You can download these right online from the Landlord and Tenant Board website. So it's going to be form either N11, which is an agreement to end the tenancy. So both parties are signing a document to basically say, yeah, we're in agreement to end this thing. Right? And so if your tenant wants to sign that before you go to market because you've got a great relationship with them, great, get it signed, you're good to go. And they've already, basically said to the next owner or the purchaser, like, hey, we're going to leave. As someone who, obviously sells a lot of properties, but we also represent a lot of buyers, it can oftentimes make it easier if you've got a great relationship with the tenant to be able to prove to the next purchaser that they're not going to have a problem, because that is something that is always in the back of a purchaser's mind when they buy something that's tenanted. Like, hey, is this person actually going to leave before the closing date? And what happens if they don't leave by the closing date, right? Because that's a big concern, and that can also be an issue for you down the line if costs are incurred on the buy side of things. So an N11 is an agreement to end the tenancy for both parties. Now let's talk about the alternative, which is probably the more likely form that you're going to need to use, and that is the N12. And the N12 is a notice to end your tenancy. So it would be when the purchaser decides that they're going to move in the property and you've got the property under contract. You would fill out this form and it basically says, hey, tenant, we are going to be ending your tenancy because we have sold the property and the new purchaser is moving in. So let's look at this form together, okay? So section A, when to use this notice. You have 2 reasons on why you could use this notice. 1, a member of your immediate family or a person who provides or will provide care services to you or a member of your immediate family wants to move into the rental unit and occupy it for at least 1 year. So this is obviously outside of the scope of this conversation. This is for your own personal use and why you could kick them out, okay? Now, reason 2 goes hand in hand with this particular video, and that is the purchaser or a member of the purchaser's immediate family or a person who will provide or who provides or will provide services to the purchaser or a member of the purchaser's immediate family wants to move into the rental unit. And the complex contains no more than 3 residential units, and you have entered into an agreement of purchase and sale. So If the purchaser wants to move in, the purchaser's immediate family or a caretaker of that immediate family is going to move in for at least 1 year. You would then be authorized to ask the current tenant to vacate your property for those purposes. Now, the tenant can ask for an affidavit to be signed. Some of them do, some of them don't. And there's an affidavit on the Landlord Tenant Board website to say that the purchaser is in fact moving into the property. And if they decided otherwise to not move into the property, it would be on them to deal with. However, seek legal counsel on that. I'm not a lawyer. If you need any further context around these forms, I would definitely recommend speaking to a paralegal or speaking to a lawyer. Now, let's talk about the termination date, because that's also going to be really important to you. And I want to go through this and understanding the timeframes associated with this. So the termination date must be at least 60 days after the date that you give the tenant this notice. Also, the date must be on the last day of the rental period, or if the tenancy is for a fixed term, the last day of the fixed term. That sounds like a lot of words, and what does that mean? So here's a very simple example on how this can be implemented. So at the time of this recording, it is April 6th. For the purposes of this example, I need to provide some context and framework around this, example tenancy. We'll say the tenants pay on the first day of every month, because most tenants do, and we'll assume that the tenants that are currently in the property have been there for over a year and now are on a month-to-month term. The property gets sold yesterday. So April 5th, we get a firm deal, we sign it. Okay, great. Today, I go to the tenant and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Tenant, the property has been sold, no condition, the deal is done. I'm going to need you to vacate the property because the buyer is taking occupancy, or they're moving into the property. And so most people that read this, when it says it has to be 60 days, the termination date must be at least 60 days after the date that you give the tenant the notice, they're like, cool, well, I gave it to you on April 6th, so you got to be out of there on June 6th. But that's not the case, and that's not how it's written here, and I think this is where people get confused. It says the date must be on the last day of the rental period. And so if you give them notice on the 6th, we're already in the rental period. So the next rental period right now would be May 1st. And so for the purposes of this example that I'm giving to you guys, the notice would actually be for June 30th, because you're giving it, the notice essentially kicks in on May 1st, and then they've got 60 days to move out because we're starting the new rental period. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So if you're on a month-to-month lease with your tenant and you sell the property mid-month and you go to give termination notice mid-month, it'll be from the first day of the next month to keep that 60 days in alignment. So for my example here, we're actually closer to 90 days because we're giving notice, the month has already rolled over and we're giving notice earlier in the month. Okay, so you need to take that into consideration when you're setting your closing date before you're accepting the offer, because you don't want to get yourself into hot water where you promise the purchaser vacant possession and you give the wrong notice to the tenant. That would be terrible. Okay, and then the second part of this is also very important, and I think people get confused about this as well. And it says if the tenancy is for a fixed term, it would be the last day of the fixed term. And so the second example that I'll give you is the same thing, but let's assume that they're not on a month-to-month basis and that their actual lease ends September 1st. Well, you could not ask the tenant to vacate the property while they're still in a fixed lease with you. So when you went to market the property, you would have to say, if you want to close on June 30th, the same date as the previous example, it would be your responsibility, purchaser, to assume the tenant until their lease ends because they're still technically under contract with you. Or we have to extend the closing date for after the fixed term tenancy, which in this example would be September 1st, let's say. So you need to take that into consideration when you're listing, because if you're in a market where a lot of, there's a lot of first-time buyers, so we'll say Toronto, downtown, you got a lot of investors, but you've also got a lot of end users. If the tenant is still in a fixed term for a couple of months, let's say 4 or 5 months, these guys might not want to wait that long to close, or they may be unwilling to close early. Like if you're selling to an end user and they've only got 5% down, they wouldn't actually be able to even assume the tenant because they would need 20% down because it would look like they're purchasing a rental property, right? And so all of these things need to be taken into consideration before you go to actually list the property to figure out what the time frame looks like and how it works. So hopefully that provides some further context. 60 days actually means 60 days from the next, from the first day of the next month. It doesn't mean 60 days. If you're giving notice on the first day of the month, sure, it's 60 days then, but it's the first day of the next month. And if the tenant is still in an actual lease with you and it hasn't rolled over that 1 year and they're not month to month, you can't ask them to vacate before that date unless they volunteer or otherwise agree to. But for the purposes of this N12 form, you can't do that, okay? Again, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, so if you got further questions about this, reach out to a lawyer. Okay, let's talk about scenario 2. That is not selling the property to an end user and selling a property to an investor. An investor cannot just ask to kick the tenant out because they want to make more money. That's not how it works. And the Landlord and Tenant Board is very much against that. So if you're selling the property to an investor will typically have to assume the current tenant and wait for that tenant to agree to vacate the property before they can replace the tenant at current market rents, right? And again, look into your the legalities of increasing rents in your given area, all that kind of stuff. But you can't just ask the tenant to move out because you want more money. That's not really how it works. And so scenario 2 is pretty simple. You would transfer the lease over to the new purchaser, okay? Now, this is where things get really interesting in this video, and I want to go through some strategies that I've used because I've sold a lot of these properties and sometimes it goes really smoothly and the tenants are fantastic and they help and they're accommodating and they're open to it, okay? That's the best, obviously. The flip side is I've also had some more challenging situations where the tenants don't want to leave. I mean, at the end of the day, let's look at the scope of this. You're the owner of the property, so you are within your rights to sell the property. There's no questions about that. However, as a human being, this is also their house and you opted to rent it to them. And some people, they have either, great rental rate or their kids are in the school district that and they don't want to move their kids out of school or whatever it happens to be. So they dig their heels in because they don't want the property to be sold. And we have to be understanding of that. However, you are still within your right to sell the property because you own it, okay? So a couple of things that I've done in the past. We'll talk about strategy number 1. Strategy number 1 that I would suggest is work together, okay? It typically goes one of 2 ways. You have a great relationship with your tenant, and as a realtor or your real estate agent, or whoever your representative is going to be to sell the property, comes in, and it's a pretty easy insertion of a third party into that dynamic. And especially if you're working with someone who has some experience with this, we can talk around, how this is going to go, and getting a better understanding of their schedule and how we can accommodate showings and all of that kind of stuff to build a strategy to get this sold for the highest price in the shortest amount of time with, and making it as convenient as possible with their current lifestyle. Because if they make it really challenging, it will typically affect point 1, which is price, okay? And so that's great. However, on the flip side of it, if you as a landlord don't have a great relationship with your tenant and then you insert a third party into that dynamic, sometimes it is quite a bit of pushback from the tenant side of things, and they may not, answer our calls or want to communicate with us. And so the first strategy that I have is to try and, sit down with all parties to say, hey, look, this is convenient. This is inconvenient for everyone. Like, we are actually going to inconvenience your life temporarily. How do we do this, and how do we build a strategy together to shorten that time frame given what's happening in the market? So, what I've done in the past is said, we need availability throughout the day, typically in the evenings, because that's usually when showings happen. Can we block off a certain range, and can you give us availability here? We will give you the 24 hours notice, because of course you need to provide at least 24 hours notice to gain access to the unit. And then one other thing that's also been very helpful is to say, look, I know you're a human being. You probably like to sleep in on weekends or whatever. We need accessibility to show the property over the weekend. Maybe we do one day. Do you prefer Saturday or do you prefer Sunday for showings? Like, what day do you want for yourself, right? And normally that really lets the guard down, because they're like, okay, what they're trying to do is get this thing sold as quickly as possible. And the quicker we can get it sold, the better it is for the tenant, because then they don't have to deal with all the showings and the notices and all of this kind of stuff. And so when you go in there and you say, this is our plan of action, our plan of action is to get this sold quickly, and it's going to be inconvenient for, let's say, a week or whatever the duration is, depending on the market. We want to get it sold within this. We need your help to do that, because I don't want to inconvenience you for a month. Most people are pretty understanding to that. So strategy one is to work together to set up, some type of meeting to have open lines of communication, to build a strategy and to let the tenant feel heard and involved in the process, because you need them. As much as you might say, well, it's my place and I own it and blah, blah, it doesn't matter that you feel that way. I'm sorry. What matters is that they're willing to work with you so that you can get what you want out of the situation as well. So we need to work together. Strategy two. You may or may not like this one, but it's something that has worked well in the past, and it really depends on your equity position and cash flow position. But that is offering an alternative accommodation for the week that you go to market. So the market's obviously been quite hot. It's changing now, but in a market where you're getting multiple offers and properties are usually selling in, let's say, 7 days or less, you might say, look, well, if I can get the tenant out of here for a week and spend money on staging, I think I'm going to get X return. Let's say it's 50 grand, a 50 grand difference, which sometimes staging it can be, just depending on, the property and location and whatnot. Well, for you to invest $2,000 for the tenant to move so that you can make 50 grand, as an investor, that's a pretty damn good return. And so you may or may not be open to it. The tenant may or may not be open to it, but for them, you might be able to say, hey, look, I'll send you to, I'll get you a cool Airbnb in Muskoka if you work from home for a week. And that way you get a little bit of a vacation and it's on us, So then they're like, oh, cool. And now you have full access to the property where you don't need 24 hours notice and that kind of thing. So that strategy costs money, but it works well, and it gives them something, and it's a benefit to them. The third strategy is something that goes together with point number one, which is working together. If you have open lines of communication and the tenant knows that the property is going to be sold, some of them will agree to ending the tenancy anyways, as we discussed with Form N11. And so what you might say is, look, the property is going to get sold, but we have a good relationship. And if you're willing to do that, we're going to do everything that we can to help you find an alternative rental. So make sure that your agent is open to helping them, because you're literally asking them, well, not asking them, you're kind of telling them, hey, this property is getting sold, you got somewhere else to go. Okay, well, how can we help you transition to an easier, how can we make this transition easier for you? And so sometimes that's, hey, can we sign the N11, we'll help you find another place, we can figure out what the closing looks like on that, help you with maybe even the moving costs or whatever it happens to be, and then we can list the property thereafter, depending on, again, how the market's moving, and you have to address this on a case-by-case situation. But, option 3 and strategy 3 is provide them alternative solutions and assist them and provide them support into where they're moving. So, scenario 1 is open lines of communication with working together. Scenario 2 is offering alternative accommodations during the listing period at your expense. And then option number 3 is like almost a hybrid of the two, where it's, we have open lines of communication, property's getting sold anyways. Would you be open to discussing this? And I can also help you make this transition easier, because I know that it's inconvenient. So again, ultimately what this all boils down to is being empathetic to their situation. Again, totally understand that it is your property, you're within your right to sell it, but it's also their home, and you need to be understanding of that, and you need to work with someone who is understanding of that, because we need to work together to make all 3 things happen so that every party is happy with the outcome. Like ideally it's a win-win-win. And if someone feels like they're winning and someone feels like they're losing, it typically isn't a great situation. One last thing I forgot to mention to you, which kind of goes with the N12 notice, is that you are required, you can see the information about compensation, if you ask the tenant to leave and to vacate the property, you must either pay the tenant an amount equal to 1 month's rent as compensation or offer the tenant another rental unit that is acceptable to them. If you pay the tenant compensation, it must be paid on or before the termination date of this notice. So that can help to kind of cover some costs, that helps to cover moving costs and all that kind of stuff. So note that regardless of whatever strategy you use, if you implement the N12, you can be responsible for paying 1 month back to the tenant to ask them to leave regardless of the situation. And that brings things to a wrap. I hope that you guys found this video valuable. Again, if you did, please like and subscribe. Trying to grow the channel, still relatively new here, and I promise that I'm going to have a ton more valuable kind of tactical and tangible items to help you in the real estate market in the coming weeks. So thanks for being here. Have a great day. And again, smash that like button.